Good morning and welcome to this course on Ruskin Bond's All Roads Lead to the Ganga. Now, quite obviously, we've taken some kind of a hiatus and a break. So we will just brush up with the idea of why, I put this text into your syllabus. Now, Ruskin Bond, of course, remains one of India's most endearing writers. And the other thing is that within this corpus of travel writing that we've studied, it's always been a kind of a study of texts which have been approximately about the West, or even if it's to the smaller towns. It hasn't been across one sustained theme. Now, obviously, this particular text will be around one of India's major themes, and that is the Tirtha across the rivers. But you'll find that I've taken one author who does not really belong to the Hindu pantheon, as it were, and talks about the river, the environment, the philosophy of the mountains from a slightly different perspective, in the sense that Bond is an Indian, but he's placed outside the dominant Hindu canon of travel writing. And therefore, part of our course will take a look at the way in which river ecology pilgrimage is seen through the prism of an insider-outsider. Bond, who is an Indian, very much an Indian, but who's also outside the kind of tradition of Hindu writing on the pilgrimage. So in that sense, what I'm trying to do is taking a look at the pilgrimage tradition, the river, its importance in Indian mythology, folklore, travel writing, as well as probably taking a look at the way in which an outsider would also take a look at this tradition of the Tirtha. So I'm bringing the pilgrimage in, but in a slightly different modulation. Right, of course, one of the other things that we'll be looking at is how travel writing, especially contemporary travel writing, this book, All Roads Lead to Ganga, was published in 1992, looks at the notion of ecology and the environment within this corpus of travel writing. So it promises to be a reasonably, dense mix of various themes. But before I move on to Bond, it's probably important for you to take a look at the map and the geography of the terrain that I'm going to talk about, because Bond is going to write within a particular tradition of travel writing, in the sense that he's writing within a particular space. So let me share with you the map of Uttarakhand, which is the focus of Bond's writing, really. And just give me a moment. I'm sharing my screen with you, and I hope that you are able to see this. If you can, please just give me a message so that it is visible. Right. So this is Uttarakhand, basically. This is a tourist map of Uttarakhand. You can see this is Uttar Pradesh on the southern side, and you have Nepal on the eastern side. You have China on the northern side, and Himachal Pradesh primarily on the western side, really. Now, this is where Bond would be starting his life from, basically. Dehradun, where he's sort of brought as a young child to live with his mother and his stepfather. He's, of course, educated in Shimla and the school in Busari early on in his life. So this is Busari. right? So Dehradun, this is Mussoorie. So this book, incidentally, will be divided into three different parts of travel writing. One which will talk about the childhood town of Mussoorie and the area of Dehradun. The second is where he'll actually be talking about the river, and he'll be talking about the Pancha Kedar, which is one of the most important mountain uh, pilgrimages of Hindus. He'll be talking, of course, about Badrinath and Kedarnath. He'll talk about Tunganath also. But this is basically the route that he'll be talking about. If you follow my cursor, this is how the river Alakananda comes from Badrinath and Kedarnath. Right, so this is the Alakananda, which will travel down here and meet at the Prayags. The Prayags, of course, being the places where the two rivers meet. This is Kedarnath. This is Rudraprayag. This is again the terrain of Rudraprayag. And he will talk about also Gangotri, the origin of the river Ganga from Gomukh. And this is the way in which the Bhagirathi will be coming down. This is the Bhagirathi, if you remember. And it will sort of come together at Rishikesh. So this is the Tehri Garhwal that he will be talking about in the second part of the text. And finally, he will be talking about the flora and the fauna and the environment and the people of this region. So three segments of the travel text. One in which he talks about Mussoorie and Dehradun. The other in which he talks about the Pancha Kedar, and that is where the Ganga comes in. And he'll be talking about the flora and the fauna in this entire belt in the final segment of the travelogue. So that is how we'll also move. And we'll be making comments on how and what Bond has to say about the river and the effect of the mountains, especially. So it's not only about the Ganga. It is equally about the mountains, the Tehri Garhwal region. It is about Mussoorie. It is about the colonial hill station. It is about the presence of the quaint old colonial world, and then traveling into the post-colonial independent India and the problems of post-colonial independent mountain India, overcrowding, environmental degradation, and the flora and the fauna that make up this region. So you will, of course, need to realize that Bond is talking about a different tradition of travel writing, really, because this is where, he is, in that sense, an Indian writing about India, although he's a little distanced, as I pointed out. But this is about an insider's view of the topography, the terrain, the flora, and the fauna. So it's not merely about the people who make up travel. It's also about the river, the topography, the birds, the trees that make up the entire corpus of travel writing. We'll also take a look at how Bond is creating a travel writing that is at once both meant for adults as well as for children. Now, so far as we've looked at it, travel writing has been largely seen as a kind of an adult genre, one which is solely directed towards, mature readers who are looking for a political angle into travel writing. Now, Bond, of course, has his politics. There are political leanings within the text, but this is also text largely meant to familiarize a kind of travel for children. So how does one write this entire travelogue for children is something which we shall also take a look at. So I'll stop sharing the map, but you need to remember this map when we are talking about travel writing of Bond, really. Now, the other thing that I'd like to just talk very briefly about is the career of Ruskin Bond before I enter into the text proper. Now, you will, of course, know that Ruskin Bond was by birth an Anglo-Indian, in the sense that he was born of English parents, Edith Clarke and Aubrey Alexander Bond, and he was born in Kasauli in India, right? So he's an Indian, and Bond talks about his Indianness subsequently in many of his essays, in his smaller essays. And he was once asked what made him an Indian. And I'm quoting from an interview. And I think this is a very important quote which you should listen to time and time again. He says, race did not make me one. That's an Indian. Race did not make me one. Religion did not make me one. But history did. So Bond is at pains to point out that, the English were by now part and parcel of Indian history, and Bond's father actually sort of taught English to the Princess of Jamnagar Palace, and he went on later to go to London to become a pilot of the Royal Air Force in 1939, and he was killed subsequently in the Second World War. But history did. So history is what makes me an Indian. And in the long run, it's history that counts. My writing has changed because I have become more philosophical. So Bond is acutely conscious of his identity as an Indian, but is also conscious of his positionality, unique positionality in the sense that the Anglo-Indians found themselves as they were sandwiched in between the Indian identity and the European identity. So this positionality is very interesting for Bond. One, because it justifies the fact that he's writing in English. One. Secondly, that he can therefore find a critical perspective through which he can look at both the Europeans and the Indians. Right? So he's placed in this midsection, in this liminality of history, where he identifies with India, but he can have a kind of critical distance with the perspective of the Hindu Indian or the Muslim Indian or the Christian Indian in that sense of the term. So he has both an interiority into India as well as a certain critical perspective through which he can look at India. And Bond's critical perspective is always humorous and sensitive. So he identifies with India. He has this bond with India. He's never really very judgmental. But if there is a criticism, there's a very ironic, subtle, humorous criticism. And this is the tone in which he sort of adapts in almost all his texts. Right. So as I pointed out, Bond was born in 1934. He's born to English parents. His father lives initially in Jamnagar and then goes off to 1939. He goes off to London. But Bond stays on in India with his mother and sister and stays at Dehradun. Now, we saw Dehradun, therefore, becoming, in a certain way, the locus classicus for Bond. It is in Dehradun, Deoli, Mussoorie that almost all his texts are situated. And you will remember that a large part of Bond's stories, a large part of Bond's memoirs, short stories, even his novels are set within this particular terrain, and his autobiographical accounts. His childhood seems to have had a very profound effect on his life, as many of you who have read The Room on the Roof will remember. Now, then he's sent to a boarding school in Mussoorie. So Dehradun, Mussoorie becomes the locus classicus through which he's looking at the world. Now, of course, then when he's 8 years old, his parents separate. And this separation is distance from his father, the sense of a broken family. This element of belonging seems to be part and parcel of Bond's writings to a large extent. The figure of Rusty, for example, is largely based on this particular period of Bond's personal crisis. Now, then he, of course, travels with his father to New Delhi, and he settles there, and he's very happy with his father at this point of time. But when he's 10, his father dies of malaria when he's posted in Calcutta. And Bond at this point of time is in Shimla, where he's heartbroken, but he's brought to live with his mother and stepfather in Dehradun. So Dehradun, Mussoorie becomes, once again, as I repeatedly point out, the critical creative zone in which Bond operates. Once again, this sense of, a certain sense of isolation that Bond faces in his career, as it were, in his childhood, that becomes very important for the writing of the text. And in several repeated interviews, Bond has talked about the absence of the father and his longing for the figure of the father, as it were, a kind of incompleteness within himself that brings in the characters that he presents. Also remember that a large number of stories that Bond writes are about humorous ghosts, the presence of the dead within his novels, texts, which are very important in the sense that this early death in the family had left an indelible mark on his career, as it were. Now, Bond, of course, then goes to Bishop Cotton School in Shimla, graduates in 1950, and by the age of 16, he's already written some of his very important short stories. Now, in 1951, Bond goes to UK. So here is Bond, somebody who's born in India, identifies himself as an Indian, educated in some of the most important, we'll say, boarding schools, Catholic boarding schools of the country, who is grappling with his Indianness and his Englishness. He arrives in London and starts writing The Room on the Roof. And he stays with his aunt for almost 2 years. Now, The Room on the Roof wins the John Llewellyn Rhys Prize in 1957. And Bond is, at this point of time, working in a photo studio. And after getting it published, Bond uses this money to no longer stay in London, but come back to India and to Bombay. And thereafter, he settles in Dehradun. Now, therefore, 1951 to 1957, 6 years, he stays in England. But very interestingly, England does not figure that much in his writings at all. Right, so you can understand that Bond's identity is firmly located within India, and he sees himself essentially as an Indian. Now, he settles initially in Delhi, but then he comes back to Dehradun, and thereafter he settles from 1963 onwards at Mussoorie in a place called Ivy Cottage, where he still lives. And he turns full-time to writing, whereby, he, with his very few wants, continues to make a living. Today, of course, Bond is now one of India's most published writers, and therefore, I don't think Bond is exactly scrounging for money right now. But the fact remains that Bond has retained his very simple lifestyle. He travels in the morning, almost daily, to different parts, walks, and signs books one day a week in Mussoorie, where his house has become a kind of a tourist spot. Right. Now, before I go on to any other comment on Bond, let me just talk about a few of the interviews that he's given and his modus operandi for writing. Now, he talks about nature, memories, families, and animals. Nature, memories, families, and animals as being some of the most important themes of his writing. And he suggests that, he is best at telling the story through my eyes. Right. There is a very strong absence of religion in Bond's tales. Instead, what he focuses on are the people of the terrain, as it were. Therefore, it is the people. And we were talking about Vishwanath Ghosh the other day, and he suggested it that, travel writing is not essentially made up of only, the nature, the topography, the sceneries that you see around you, but also about the people that you meet. So in that sense, Bond suggests that his essential quality of writing is looking at people. And this is what he has to say about the travelogue. So he was asked why he chose the travelogue and what is its speciality. And Bond writes that in a travelogue, you can jump from one thing to another. In a travelogue, I repeat, you can jump from one thing to another. You need not plan in advance and can let it happen. In fact, the unexpected makes it exciting. Let me read it once again. In a travelogue, you can jump from one thing to another. You need not plan in advance and can let it happen. In fact, the unexpected makes it exciting. Therefore, like the river, Bond's travelogues are meandering, somewhat disjointed narratives where the first person I becomes a very important prism through which people, nature is looked at. And therefore, you get a sense of interiority, his own philosophy, his own musings. So it's the self that is being quintessentially written into the travelogue in Bond's travel writings. Right. So what have we actually looked at? We've looked at Bond's, very strange positionality. We've looked at, Bond's positionality as being in between the two identities of the European and the Indian. We've taken a look at Bond's Indianness and his claim to India by virtue of colonial history and his integral identification with the Indian topography and people. The third thing that we've looked at is Bond's interest in a particular topography, nature, location, and people. The fourth thing that we've looked at is the presence of the autobiographical self in Bond's writings, both novelistic and in the travelogue. Fifth, we've seen Bond's idea of the travelogue as largely loose and unjoined fragments meandering like the river, right? And finally, we've taken a look at Bond's idea of, language, which is simple, which, celebrates the visual. It's very powerfully visual writing in the sense that it's creating pictures in very simple language and therefore bringing a new genre of the travelogue meant for both adults and children. Right. So that is what we've taken a look at through a brief idea of the career of Ruskin Bond. Now let me quickly move on to the text and share the segments of the text, which once again I had sent to you earlier. So I'm sure you have the text with you, and therefore let me share at least one of the initial segments. This is the text of All Roads Lead to the Ganga. Now, if you take a look at, as I pointed out, this is 1992. Now, this is the contents page in your text. And you'll see that, the first five, or rather the first six chapters of the text do not talk about the river at all. It rather talks about the mountain, the writer on the hill, running up the dune, until the place where he talks about Landor Bazaar in Busari. And then you have six approximate chapters which talk about the mountains and the river. So the Mandakini, the Tunganath, Badrinath, right. So you have the Panch Kedar here, which are described in terms of the mountain and the river. And then the last 5 chapters, if you take a look at it, talk about the flora, the fauna, the birds, and the bees of the mountains. So you have the great trees, bird song, and then also you have, interestingly, you know, in that sense, a colonial history that is welded into Dehradun and Mussoorie. So the early plant collectors, and it talks about the topography also, and the Dehra. It ends with the Dehra I know. So it's interesting in the sense that it begins with the self, the writer on the hill, and it ends with the Dehra I know. So Bond is at pains at the beginning of the text, at the end of the text, to suggest how the travelogue is essentially welded with a notion of the self. It is the self which is, according to Bond, the most important factor in travel writing. Right. Let me quickly take a look at the first few chapters, and that's what I'm going to do really today, to take a look at the first 6 chapters before I actually enter tomorrow's lecture, which is probably going to be about the rivers and the Panchakedars. Now, Bond begins this book with this concept of the writer in the mountain. And he talks about why the mountain is such a fascinating aspect of travel writing. Now, if you take a vote amongst this class and you ask, who is in favor of the mountain and who is in favor of the seas as your favorite holiday spot. So given that the pandemic ends and you get a nice tidy sum of money and you're given an option to take an excursion to, say, Badrinath and say a place like Goa. Like I can see 33, 34 odd people here. So where would you like to go? Goa or say a place like Badrinath or even Darjeeling? Right, take a quick vote and you'll find that there's almost an even distribution between the mountain and the ocean. Well, my vote, of course, will go to the ocean. I do not like mountains so much, but Bond does. And Bond says, why? Why? What is the importance of the mountain? And you see how the book begins off with an individual kind of a philosophical note. Therefore, why does one travel really to the mountain? He says mountains are permanent things. They are stubborn. They refuse to move. That's what I like about them. They are here to stay. So it's about his personal preference for the mountains and his desire to travel among the mountains. And he says, I like to think that I've become part of this mountain, this particular range, and that by living here so long, I have able to claim a relationship with trees, wildflowers, even the rocks that are an integral part of it. So very powerfully, Bond, without any theoretical, leaning or whatsoever, he suggests or he identifies completely with the nature and the mountain. So the consciousness of the environment and human beings as being part of it rather than taking a vantage point about it. Bond is very humble in that sense that he identifies with the mountain, and the mountain recognizes that the mountain is more powerful than him. So he says, I felt that I was part of a forest. I put out my hand and touched the bark of an old tree. So one of the things that Bond is suggesting is that being an environmentalist is not theoretical. It is part and parcel of an empathy which you feel with nature. And therefore, that is one of the major impetus of travel, getting lost in nature. And then he sort of kind of mocks the fashionable environmentalist. He says, now there is an outcry. It is suddenly fashionable to be an environmentalist. But he doesn't make a judgment. He says, that's all right. Perhaps it isn't too late to save the little that's left. Right. So very interestingly, Bond is within his text indicating that his text is also a manifesto of environmentalism in that sense that his identification with the forest his his disillusionment with the encroachment of civilization amongst the forest is an important indicator of the environmental politics, or the environmental consciousness within his narrative. Right. And then he talks about the hill people. So, apart from the topography, you see, it's the people who are also important. And he says that they have their work cut out just to wrest a livelihood from their thin, calcinated soil. So, in that sense, he's suggesting that it's topography that very often determines the kind of people that we are. For many of us who live on the plains, life is much more easygoing, so we become lazier. Not so the people of the hills, and we have some of our students also from the mountainous regions who will tell you that survival on the hills is far more difficult, and hence you are conditioned into work in a particular way. Then, interestingly, he talks about how his writing for children have been instigated by the presence of the hills, in that sense that the simplicity of the life of the hills provides him with the simplicity of perspective that makes him write about children. So it's interesting in the way Bond is suggesting right at the beginning of the travelogue the importance of the place that you are visiting in conditioning a kind of selfhood that you imbibe. So it's the place also, it's the philosophy of nature that very often determines the kind of selfhood that you bring into yourself. Now, that is a uniquely philosophical perspective. And that is where I see, Bond interweaving delight, simple narrative, philosophy, natural consciousness into his texts. Right. And then he talks about, why the hills have been a source of his creativity. He says, one seldom ran short of material. There was a stream at the bottom of the hill, and this gave me many subjects: animals, wildflowers, bees, trees, insects. The nearby villages were of absorbing interest. So were the old houses and old families of Landor and Mussoorie hill stations. Now, he then talks about the freedom that only the mountains can give, and you have come near the very borders of heaven. Now, one small thing that I'd like to talk about, and before I go on to anything else, is you see Bond's writings. If you read his ghost stories, you will find that most of them are populated by humorous ghosts of the colonial era. So, in that sense, if the ghost stories are tales about the past, then Bond is talking about this kind of colonial past that India had and its imprint and narrative through the ghost stories. So if you decide at any point of time to work on Bond's ghost stories, you need to keep that in your mind. Now, also, let me talk about a story called The Angry River, which Bond wrote. It's not a story really, it's a small novella. And he talks about this girl and her life in a small village, and her grandfather is called away, and she has a small doll which she calls Munni, and her grandfather instructs her that she is to immediately sort of leave her house and climb on top of a tree if there's a flood. And then she climbs on top of the tree because the flood is looming, and the tree is uprooted, and she's carried across the river, and she's rescued by a small young boy called Kishan. And Kishan actually brings her back to the grandfather. The grandmother has passed away, and she sets up her life once again with her grandfather. Now, you see, this story about Kishan and the way in which Bond is blending Indian myth into his stories makes him this quintessentially Indian writer. On the other hand, the story about the mountain, the flood, the uprooting of the tree, the poverty that these people have, are also equally talking about the realistic life on the mountains. So I think it's this mix that Bond brings in. When he talks about the kind of myths that are associated, the legends that are associated with places of all his religions in India, and the intense and very strong realist appeal that he brings to the texts. So the travelogue is part of this kind of, sense of time. On the one hand, philosophy, which is beyond time, and on the other hand, the absolute here and now, which is empirical time. Now, notice that he's talking about the past, the present, and he's also equally talking about the future, where the mountains are taken over by civilization. So, in that sense, this travelogue is really meant for children and for adults, talks about the environment, talks about the philosophy, talks about nature, his own experiences, the people, and therefore brings together many perspectives into it. Right, so that's chapter number 1, The Writer on the Hill. In the next chapter, where he talks about the Rani of the Doon, he talks about Dehradun and his life on Dehradun, and he talks about Dehradun and Mussoorie and the way in which Mussoorie was built and Dehradun was built. He talks about Rani Karnavati. So he's giving us a history of how settlement at Dehradun happened. And then he talks about the gazetteer. So he's well read about colonial history, and he talks about Binsar, and he talks about the Doon, the past of Dehradun, scattered villages, the Doon of Rani Karnavati's reign, right? Scattered villages, a little cultivation here and there, and then comes the British period. So within the travelogue is also weaving in a little bit of history. 1817, when the Gurkhas give away the Doon, and then you have the British who give the first census. And Dehradun has a population in 1817 of 2,100 only. And it says today, 1992, you have 5 lakh people. So the Rani of the Doon is essentially the story of Dehradun. And then he moves on in chapter number 3 to the trees that have made up his childhood. So it's not merely about the mountains, but Dehradun and Mussoorie are part and parcel of a particular kind of mountain range, which are marked by deciduous forests. It's talking about the trees that were an essential component of his childhood. And the ancient banyan tree that he talks about, the jackfruit tree, what is the kathal gach for us Bengalis, and the jackfruit trees and the banyan trees. The tree was older than the house, he says, and older than my grandparents, as old as Dera, he says. And then he goes on to talk about the tree as a world in itself, populated with small beasts, large insects, butterflies, and the honeybees, as it were. And the tree during different times, the tree during the monsoon, the tree during the night becomes an important part. And he also situates himself within this tree, which becomes his playground, as it were. A flute in my hands, I would try adding my shrill piping to theirs. And he immediately, there's an irony here. He says, they thought poorly of my musical ability, the insects and the birds. The birds and the insects would subside into a pained and puzzled silence. Right, so see how this is gradually building up. So he talks about the writer in the hills. He talks about his own perspective, the self. Then he talks about the place. Then he talks about the trees which make up the mountains. And then he moves on to the people. A village in Garhwal is the next village that he talks about. And he then talks about this absence of mountain writing in the Indian tradition. Of course, I disagree with Ruskin Bond here, because there's been a considerable, literature in the regional languages on the mountains. Especially, you have an entire gamut of writings in Bangla, of course, also in Hindi, I am sure. So he suggests that the lack of writing is because the mountains have remained remote, mysterious, and spirit haunted. But he identifies the Himalayas with humility and patience, and the people having a particular temperament. Right. So uh, he says that it is the, the 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 hills, as it were, or the mountain, does not provide much living for the people themselves, and therefore they are very importantly drawn towards alternate sources of living. So he talks about the Garhwal rifles. You will find also that in the northeast, for example, in Darjeeling, uh, in Nepal, for example, soldiering has become, alternative professions are an important source of livelihood for the people, because the mountain has very little to give in that sense of the term. And then he talks about the family that he visits in Manjari village in the Dudhatoli range. And he talks about the simple life of Gajadhar, who sort of wants to be a kind of a soldier, and therefore Gajadhar wants to be a soldier, and uh, he is therefore given the army entrance examination, and there is the the description of abject poverty, the very little crops that this family can afford. He has only two meals a day, one at 7 in the morning and the other at 6 or 7 in the evening when he returns from school, which is 10 kilometers. Therefore, he sort of travels 20 kilometers every day just to go to the school. So it gives us an idea of the kind of rigor and the kind of effort that the people in the mountains have to make, not only to get a living but also to get an education. So when he's asked, what food do you have, he says, I know all the berries on the mountains. And if somebody falls ill, then of course they have their own herbal remedies, and if somebody is very ill, then he's taken to the hospital. Right. Therefore the postman then brings the news that Gajadhar has qualified in the examination, has passed the examination, and therefore there is this idea of a feasting within the village where a goat is sacrificed and a local song is performed for Gajadhar, who will be leaving in the morning and who will then come back and marry and the local girl, and will settle down in the hills. Right. So and then he talks about this very common day within Garhwal. He says the lanterns flick silently over the hillside and go out one by one. This Garhwali day, which is like any other day in the hills, slips quietly into the silence of the mountains. As I close my eyes, someone brushes against the lime tree, bruising its leaves, and fresh fragrance comes to me on the night air, making the moment memorable all the time. So, what is Ruskin Bond's USP? What is his uniqueness in writing about travel? The Bond does not write about exotic locations only. He does not make the landscape spectacular because he lives in the mountains. You see, for us who live in the plains, going to the mountain is a spectacular experience. But for somebody like somebody who stays in Darjeeling, for him, the mountain is no longer really spectacular. It is beautiful. He's alert to his beauty. But it's a part of his daily life and his daily existence. Therefore, Ruskin Bond's Travelogue is important because it gives us an idea of what Garhwali life of the everyday would be like. It familiarizes everyday Garhwal to our hills. Now, when you go for a pilgrimage, you are essentially adding value, adding a kind of sanctification to the hills. So the hill is no longer a hill, it becomes a kind of a holy shrine. Right. So Mount Kailash, for example, is something which you sort of revere, worship. Like when you cross the Ganga and the Howrah Bridge, many of us worship the Ganga for a moment. Right. But for the people who live on the Ganga is a source of livelihood, of daily experience. What the understatement style of Bond, and Bond's style is simple, a style of understatement. What it does is familiarizes the Garhwal landscape with somebody who identifies himself as a Garhwali, who is both inside Garhwal and yet who has the critical eye of the writer. Right. Therefore, this is the importance of uh, Bond's writing. Now, the other importance is, of course, his consciousness being part of the European fraternity as well, his consciousness about the older history of places like Busari and Landor Bazaar. And he therefore goes on to the tales of old Musori, and he talks about Gun Hill and a gun which was once placed and fired, and it became a source of irritation in whichever direction it was fired. And he talks about these small anecdotes, these small colonial anecdotes which are alive to him because they've been narrated down to him by his father and his parents, as it were. So he talks about how Musori came to be named from the term Mansoori range, and how one of the superintendents scrambled up from Dehradun to Musori and therefore established this kind of hill station at Musori, where the British would very often come for convalescence. Therefore, he talks about this initial areas, the Cloud End, the Dahlia Bank, and the Survey of India office, and then he talks about Emily Eden, Eden, the Earl of Auckland, Governor General of India, who comes to stay in Musori and makes it a fashionable place. And he talks about the ghost of places where Europeans have fallen off from the cliff, and therefore you have ghosts there. And then he talks about, very importantly, beer, which became a very staple sort of drink at Musori, which was manufactured in Musori. And he talks about how Busari beer became very important because, or very tasty one, after a human body had fallen into the beer processing machinery, and after which flesh or meat was added as a component in beer making. Right. Even today, if you have traveled across Shimla, you'll find that Solan on the road to Shimla is a very important location for making beer. Right. And then, of course, 1905, he says, Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales visits Busari, and this event is commemorated by the laying of a sapling, which is now grown to be a great tree. Therefore, you see, hill stations, as Vishwanath was pointing out in one of the earlier lectures, become important also because of their colonial histories. So Darjeeling too has this colonial history with it. You have a colonial history in places like Dalhousie. You have places in the northern hills, of course. Shimla, of course, is one. Manali is one. All these smaller sort of hill stations have their identification with Englishmen who made it their summer capitals and retired to it. So Bond is part and parcel of that colonial history, right? So he also recollects it and puts it this quaint anecdotal history. It's not so much factual history that he points out. It is also the anecdotal history of a place which becomes the staple of Bond's travel writings. Right. Okay, so then he talks about the railways which come in Dehradun in 1901. Very importantly, see how Bond is talking about how the hill station grows, from small settlements of Europeans, of Indians to European control, and then becoming fashionable hill stations, and then becoming modern places of living to which railways bring a new dimension. And therefore, after that, Musori then becomes a kind of modern location, as it were. After World War I, he says, Savoy and the Charleville, the hotels creep up. And after independence, you see, 1947, when, of course, uh, he says that the tourism boom starts, and he talks about how Busari becomes an overpopulated urban hub where the hills now gradually make way for urban settlement. Right. And then to continue this European history, this colonial history, Bond then talks about the main bazaar. You see, every hill station is marked by a kind of a, what you can say, a mall, right? A place where the main market is situated. You see, once again, we'll have to remember that most of these hill stations were not meant for the local people to inhabit. They were constructed in such ways that the center of this hill station was always the European settlement. And therefore, the mall, the promenade, the place where they could take their walks, enjoy themselves, become the central location for these hill stations. So you have the mall in Darjeeling, for example, and my friends who are from the hills here will probably agree with me that, then it becomes the kind of place where all the shops congregate, all the people congregate, the hub, the bustle, the tea shops all sprout up in these parts of the hill station, the hill. And therefore the local bazaar, this is the local bazaar, as it were, the mall, the colonial bazaar gets this kind of quaint English feel, which lingers on, as Bond says, in this day. And at Busari, he says this place is Landor Bazaar. Right, he says there's a clock tower in every North Indian bazaar. And this is the clock tower that is built by the British. Right, and he then talks about the smells of the hills. Now, it's also very important that those who are from the mountains will remember the very strong local smell, as it were, smoke from the wood or charcoal fires, the sweet urine, sweat and urine of mules, petrol fumes, mist, old buildings, distant pines. So it's interesting in the way, that we saw how BG was talking about a place having a travel having its own sense of smell. And this place too, Bond is also talking about these old colonial bazaars defined by their sense of smell. And then he talks about the rise of the bazaar from to serve the British soldiers. 1827, there's a military hospital that is built up for curing from the sickness and the wounds. There's a church, of course, in all these old colonial settlements. And then you have the modern day bazaar, which is made up of trinkets. And then he talks about the kabadi, the local person who brings in all kinds of antiquities, a recorder discarded by a Woodstock student, or the furniture from grandmother's time, old clothes, etc., etc. And then he talks about these old clothes which he buys. In Shantiniketan, of course, you have the Posh Mela where you have this Mora Saheber Kapur. So the goods which you are being discarded by the other countries, and you have these clothes which can often very well turn out to be very good specimens, and often they shrink after one wash. And Bond is talking about one such sweater which he has brought, a pullover which he had bought for himself, but now is being worn by his servants' children. And then he talks about, very interestingly, about the peanut seller of Mussoorie. And he talks about the old peanut seller who was as ancient as the bazaar, and who has no family. And he was a kind of a relic, as it were, of the bazaar itself. He was synonymous with the age of the bazaar. It was replaced by a newer, more joyful, youthful peanut seller who embodies the modernity of the place. So in that sense, Bond is not merely looking back to the past, but he's also looking at the changes that have been wrought in these places, the new kinds of people who are coming up, and the ways in which these places are entering into what we'll say post-independence Indian modernity, right? And he then talks about the the various rivers that he meets when he's traveling in these places. So these are, meanderings through Landor Bazaar, the peoples, the sights, the animals that he makes, the tea shop, the local tea shop, which becomes very important for as both a site where people stop. And this is where Bond makes an important distinction of the tea shop in the mountain, which is both a hotel for people who are weary and need rest, which is a source of food and tea and rejuvenation. So the tea shop becomes also a source of gossip for the local people. So tea shops become, more and more important in Bond's narratives in these places. And he talks about the mule trees. I'm sorry, the mule drivers who are an essential part of the topography. Very poor men who are for a pittance taking potatoes, which is the only staple crop that grows in these places, from one place to the other. And he's wandering across Tehri Road. Bond is. So, the common people, as I say, Bond is not exoticizing, romanticizing the mountain. He's presenting it with all its ordinariness, its poverty, its hardship, and its commonplace existence. He's talking about the sweat, the shit of the animals, the peculiar smells and sights, the people who are impoverished, who very often trust their own medicines rather than the hospitals, because it's very difficult to go to a hospital anyways. So he talks about this old bazaar, right? And he says the bakers, tailors, silversmiths, and grandsons who followed the mad sahibs to this hilltop in the 30s and 40s of the last century. Most of them are plainsmen, even though many of their houses are crooked and shaky. So it's this continuity of history. And this is very important, that Bond suggests that Indian history has not been just an erasure of the colonial past, but many of these relics of the colonial past have also continued to be part and parcel of our everyday lives. Right. So, of course, then he talks about finally this not being an island or Lebanon or the streets of New York. This is Landor in the Garhwal Himalayas. And the chapter ends with him coming across a vagrant young boy who's searching for shelter, is sleeping in the cold, and he offers, his own residence as a temporary shelter to him. Right, a thin boy wearing only a shirt and part of an old track suit. He follows me without any hesitation. He says, "If you can walk some way, I can give you a bed and a blanket. I have committed myself. I cannot pass on. A shelter for the night. That's the very least one human should be able to expect from another." So you see how Bond becomes integrated with this topography, his view. You see, if there's a traveler's way of writing, then Bond's own way of traveling, of writing this travel, is that of an insider. He does not see himself in any sense as an outsider to this entire landscape. He sees himself quintessentially as part and parcel of this landscape altogether. Right. So, what have we seen now that we sort of talked about the first segment of the text in some detail? We've seen how the travelogue for Bond is essentially like the river, something that meanders. But at the center of this meandering travelogue is the selfhood of the traveler, right? It's his point of view through which the people, the places, the flora, and the fauna is being seen. Also important is that the travelogue is not just a record of the people, it is also a record of his own philosophy towards the mountains, towards life, towards existence. So the self and the travel place cannot be segregated, right? The third thing that we've seen is how Bond is pitching his interiority, his sense of belonging to this place, although he's in that sense not really, part of, is not really exactly placed in the predicament of these people, but by his living in this particular place, he brings an interiority to the travelogue. The third thing is the simplicity of style and the simple details that he provides with sounds, sights, smells, right? So that the travelogue is available as a form not only for the adult but also for the children, right? And the way in which there is no exoticizing or romanticizing of the mountain. The mountain is seen as something which is old. The mountain is seen as something which is beyond the human, which provides a shelter, even if it is a scanty shelter for the human being, and the ways in which human beings eke out a living in the midst of these mountains. Right. So it is this language of understatement, the slight irony, slight humor, slight self deprecation that makes, and this sense of belonging with these people, the sense of consciousness about the ecology, the sense of oneness with nature that makes Bond's travelogue so very interesting. Now, in our next discussion, in our next class tomorrow at 10:30, we shall take a look at Bond interacting with the rivers which go up to make the Panchakedar and finally end up as the Ganges. Now, I make this point because, and I anticipate something that I'm going to say, is that the Ganges is, as all of you will know, is not one river, but the Ganges is made out of many, tributaries, right? You have the Bhagirathi, you have the Alakananda, you have the Mandakini, you have the Prayags where these rivers meet, and they come down to form together the final Ganga, as we know in Haridwar only. So, in that sense, for Bond also, these small anecdotes, the small history of these peoples, create this general history of a place, right? And therefore, the travelogue is seen as his interaction, his meandering intercourse with several such small narratives, where he sees not only people, but also trees, flowers, the colonial history as making the history of that place. So it is in the sense that this, many narratives which fuse into one narrative that makes up his idea of the travel narrative as well, right? So it is this that we shall take a look at later on. We shall take a look at how Bond takes a look at the Tirthas, which the holiest of holy places and the Ganga, in our next class, which shall be tomorrow. So we've been through the first segment of Bond's text. I will, of course, look forward to having you in my class tomorrow as well. And you can pitch in your, you can write down the questions that you have in your notebooks. And maybe tomorrow when we start the class, you can sort of type them in the chat box so that we can take these questions after we have completed the next class. Right. Thank you very much for your patience and your presence. Looking forward to having you tomorrow with me. Thank you very much.